The hole made no sense, and that was the first thing anyone noticed about Karel Dvořák. August of 1872 lay across the Flint Hills like a punishment. The sun had bleached the tall grass to the color of old rope, and the sky pressed down without a single cloud to break its weight. Heat bent the horizon into liquid. Cicadas screamed from every direction, their sound so constant it became a kind of silence. In the middle of that silence, in the middle of that grass, a man stood chest deep in the earth, swinging a pickaxe. He had been digging for 6 days. The hole was already 9 feet deep, in places 30 feet long, 18 feet wide. A perfect rectangle cut into the prairie with the precision of a man who understood geometry not from books, but from muscle memory. The walls of the excavation were clean, almost vertical. The exposed soil shifting from dark loam at the top to pale limestone clay at the bottom. Karel Dvořák did not explain what he was doing. He did not pause to wipe the sweat that cut pale channels through the dust on his face. He swung the pickaxe loosened. The earth switched to the shovel, threw it up and over the rim. The pile of excavated dirt grew on 3 sides of the hole like the beginnings of a burial mound. And anyone riding past on the Cottonwood Road could see the strange geometry from half a mile out. A man-made wound in the prairie, raw and deliberate and completely inexplicable. The children of the nearest homesteads had already come and gone. They'd stood along the rim the way children stand at the edge of anything deep, with that mixture of awe and the delicious fear that the ground might give way. They'd shouted questions down at the man. He hadn't answered. He just kept digging. And eventually they lost interest and drifted home with stories that grew taller than the grass. The Bohemian was digging to China. The Bohemian was building a dungeon. The Bohemian had gone crazy from the heat, which happened sometimes on the prairie, where the emptiness could press against a man's mind, the way the sky pressed against the land until something cracked. None of the stories were right. None of them were entirely wrong. Harlan Creed heard about the hole from his eldest boy, who'd heard it from the Pfeiffer twins, who'd seen it themselves. Harlan did not believe in second-hand information. He believed in his own eyes, his own assessment, his own hard-won judgment, which had kept 4,000 Union soldiers fed and supplied through the Vicksburg campaign and had kept his family alive through 3 Kansas winters since. He was 45 years old, built like a fence post, narrow, but impossible to push over, with a beard the color of iron filings, and hands that never seemed to stop moving, as though idleness were a disease he'd watched other men die from. He rode his brown mare down the Cottonwood Road on the 7th morning, and when he reached the hole, he reined up and sat in the saddle for a full minute, just looking. The morning light filled the excavation like water in a trough. Karel Dvořák was down at the bottom, kneeling beside a row of limestone blocks he'd hauled from the creek bed 2 miles south. He was fitting them together without mortar, dry stacking them the way a jeweler sets stones, checking each face with his fingertips before settling it into place. The foundation he was building was 2 feet thick and already 4 feet high from the floor of the excavation. It was the kind of foundation you'd put under a courthouse, not a homestead cabin. Harlan's mare shifted under him. He leaned forward, forearms crossed on the saddle horn. "Dvořák!" His voice carried down into the hole the way sound carries across still water, clean, undistorted. "What in the name of common sense are you doing?" Karel looked up. He was 35, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that gave nothing away unless you knew where to look. His eyes were the color of creek water, over limestone, pale clear, patient. He squinted against the morning sun that haloed Harlan's silhouette. Building a house. Harlan's jaw worked the way it did when he was calculating rations, distances, risk. He was not a cruel man. He was a precise one, and precision made him blunt. "You're burying good cottonwood timber in dirt. That lumber could fence 3 homesteads. You're sinking stone that should be chimney work into a hole that'll fill with water first hard rain. And you're spending weeks of labor a man in your position can't afford to waste." He paused. "You've got a wife. You've got children. Build something that makes sense." Karel picked up another limestone block, turned it in his hands, set it down with a click that echoed off the clay walls. He did not look up again. His voice came from below like something spoken from the bottom of a well. "The earth will hold it." 4 words, no argument, no defense, no elaboration, just a quiet certainty that sounded to Harlan Creed exactly like the sound of a man who'd already made up his mind to drown and didn't want to hear about swimming. Eben Hargit had come along with Harlan, the way he often did, not by invitation, but by proximity, the way a shadow comes along with a fence post. Eben was older than both of them, past 50, with a frame that had once been powerful and was now just large like a barn that had settled on its foundation. He homesteaded the quarter section east of Harlan's, and he'd been in Kansas longer than anyone in the settlement except the Kaw people who'd been removed to Indian Territory 2 years before. He had opinions about everything and kept most of them behind his teeth, which gave the ones he let out a weight they might not have deserved. He stood at the rim of the hole, hands in his pockets, and looked down at Karl's precise stonework with an expression that was harder to read than Harlan's open disapproval. Something moved behind his eyes, not contempt, not exactly. Something older and heavier. "He's building his own coffin," Eben said, and his voice was flat factual, the way a man states the weather. Harlan glanced at him. Eben didn't elaborate. He looked at the excavated dirt piled high on 3 sides at the careful stone foundation rising from the bottom, at the man kneeling in the earth as though the earth were a church. Then he turned and walked back toward the horses, and as he passed beyond earshot, he said something so quietly that only the grass could have heard it. "I've seen dirt bury people before." He didn't say who. He didn't say when. But his shoulders carried the sentence differently after he spoke it, as though the words had been a stone he'd been holding and had finally set down. Karel Dvorak did not watch them leave. He placed another block, checked the level with the flat of his hand. The sun climbed higher, and the shadow of the rim crept across the floor of the excavation like a tide going out. By noon, the shadow would be gone entirely, and the hole would be a furnace, and Karel would keep working because the house he was building had to be finished before the first frost, and the first frost in Flint Hills came when it wanted to, not when you were ready. The question that hung over the hole like heat shimmer: why 2 feet of stone foundation when every other homesteader in the county used a few flat rocks and a prayer was a question Karel would not answer with words. He'd answer it with winter. But winter was still months away, and in the meantime the question drifted east along the Cottonwood Road through the open door of the only building in the settlement that served as store, post office, and parliament. Walt Sutter's place sat where the Cottonwood Road crossed the creek, a sodden timber rectangle, with a porch that leaned slightly to the south, as though the building itself were trying to get out of the north wind. Walt sold flour salt coffee nails, powder-shot patent medicines of dubious virtue and information of absolute reliability. He was 40, bald, thin as a rail, with spectacles. He pushed up his nose approximately once every 90 seconds, and a ledger book he maintained with the devotion of a monk transcribing scripture. Every purchase, every debt, every transaction in the settlement passed through Walt's hands, and he had the rare gift of knowing everything without appearing to care about any of it. Karel came in on a Tuesday, boots caked with pale clay dust in every crease of his clothes. He bought 4 pounds of nails, a coil of rope, and a small tin of linseed oil. He paid in coin, which was unusual. Most homesteaders ran tabs until harvest. Walt pushed his spectacles up, noted the purchase in his ledger, and spoke without looking up. "Hear you're digging quite a hole out there." Karel set the nails in his canvas bag. "A house. Deep house. Deep enough." Walt's pen paused over the ledger. He looked at Karel the way he looked at a column of figures that didn't add up. Not with suspicion, but with the mild, persistent curiosity of a man who believed all numbers eventually balanced if you found the missing entry. "The Haight place went up in 3 weeks. Creed's took 4, counting the chimney. You've been digging for 1 and haven't set a single timber yet." Karel cinched the bag closed. Different house. He left. The bell above the door jangled. Walt pushed his spectacles up, waited approximately 4 seconds, and turned to the next customer, Mrs. Pfeiffer, who'd been pretending to examine a bolt of calico while listening with the intensity of a telegraph operator. "What do you suppose he's up to?" she asked. Walt entered Carl's payment in the ledger, closed the book, and allowed himself a sentence. "Man's building something nobody around here has seen before. Either he knows something we don't, or he's about to learn something the hard way." By sundown, the sentence had reached every homestead within 5 miles, and it had grown. The Bohemian was building an underground fortress. The Bohemian had found gold in his well. The Bohemian was out of his mind. The stories contradicted each other, but they all agreed on one thing. Whatever Karel Dvořák was doing in that hole, it was not normal, and normal was how you survived on the prairie. You built what your neighbor built. You planted what your neighbor planted. You did what had been done before, because the margin between living and dying was so thin that experimentation was a luxury for people who had something to fall back on, and nobody in Flint Hills had anything to fall back on except the ground itself. Which, as it happened, was exactly Karl's point. He had not always understood this. Understanding had come the way most understanding comes to men who work with their hands through failure first, then through the long, humbling process of paying attention. Karel Dvořák was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, though farming was what the Homestead Act required of him. Back in the old country across the ocean, in a land he rarely spoke of, and never with nostalgia, he had been a sklenik, a builder of cellars, wine cellars specifically, underground vaults carved into hillsides, where temperature never wavered, where the air was always cool and still, where bottles could age for decades in conditions so stable that the wine forgot time was passing. He built arched ceilings that carried the weight of entire slopes above them. He fitted stone walls so precisely that moisture condensed on the outside and never reached the interior. His hands understood the relationship between mass and temperature, the way a musician's hands understand the relationship between tension and pitch, not as theory but as feel. You pressed your palm against a cellar wall in July and it was cool. You pressed your palm against the same wall in January and it was warm. The earth didn't care what month it was. The earth had its own temperature, deep and slow and indifferent to the seasons. And Karel's craft was the craft of borrowing that indifference of building rooms inside the planet's permanent calm. He had brought his wife Milena and their 2 children, Jakub, 7, sharp and watchful, Ruzhena, 4, who sang to herself constantly in a language that was half Czech and half invention to America in the fall of 1870, drawn by the promise of the Homestead Act. 160 acres of free land, a kingdom for a man who owned nothing. The Kansas sky was so wide it made him feel small and free at the same time, and the land rolled out in every direction like an ocean frozen mid-wave, and the grass moved in the wind with a sound like breathing. And Karel had thought, I can work with this. This earth is deep and generous. I can build here what I built in the hills back home, but bigger and for my own family and forever. Milena had stood beside him on that first evening, Ruzhena on her hip, and watched the sun go down in colors that didn't exist in the old country. Orange so deep it looked like fire seen through amber pink that shaded into purple the way a bruise shades into healing. She'd said only one thing, and Karel had carried it with him through every day since a sentence that weighed more than the stones he stacked. Any soil is soil, but winters aren't the same. She was right. She was almost always right about the things that mattered, which was why Karel had married her, and why he listened to her even when listening was inconvenient. The first winter proved her point with a brutality that left marks on all of them, some visible, some not. They arrived too late in the season to build anything but conventional. Karel put up a cabin of cottonwood logs, same as Harlan Creed's, same as Eben Haight's, same as every other homesteaders in the county. Cottonwood was what the creek bottoms offered: soft light, quick to work, and absolutely useless against cold. The trunks were stringy and porous, the bark thick but spongy. Karel chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud grass and hoped the same recipe everyone used, and the mud cracked before December, and the grass rotted by January, and the hope lasted about as long as the firewood, which was never long enough. The winter of 1870 to 1871 did not arrive. It invaded. It came across the plains from the northwest with a sound like canvas tearing, and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours, and the world turned white and stayed white. And everything Karel thought he knew about cold was revealed to be a pleasant fiction he'd been telling himself because the truth was unbearable. In the cellars of the old country, cold was a concept and abstraction measured in degrees managed with stone and geometry. On the Kansas prairie, cold was a physical force that pressed against the cabin walls like an animal trying to get in. The logs contracted at night with sounds like gunshots, sharp, violent cracks that woke everyone and set Ruzena screaming. Frost formed on the inside of the walls, not just the windows, on the walls themselves. White crystals that spread like mold across the chinking and turned the interior of the cabin into something that looked abandoned, even while 4 people huddled inside it. Jakub's leather shoes froze solid beside the door overnight. When the boy tried to put them on in the morning, the leather cracked and split along the seams like the shell of a nut. And the look on his face, not pain, not surprise, but a kind of bewilderment, as though the world had broken a promise he didn't know it had made, was something Karel would never forget. It was the face of a child learning that the adults in charge did not have everything under control. Milena held Jakub's ruined shoes in her hands and looked at Karel. And what passed between them in that look was not blame but something worse, the shared recognition that their children were in danger. And the danger was the house itself. The house they had built with their own hands. The house that was supposed to protect them and was failing at the only job it had. Milena cried once, and once was enough. She cried not because of the cold but because of the futility. She fed the fire all day. Cottonwood logs that burned fast and hot and brief like anger, and the heat poured out of the cabin through every crack and gap as fast as she could produce it. The cabin was a sieve. The fire was a bucket. She was trying to fill a river with a cup, and she knew it, and the knowing was worse than the cold, because it meant there was no solution within the system they'd built. You could not make a cottonwood cabin warm in a Kansas winter. You could make it less cold temporarily at enormous cost in labor and fuel, and then you could watch the cold come back the moment the fire died down, patient and inevitable, and utterly indifferent to your suffering. That night, with the fire dying, and Ruzena whimpering against Milena's chest, and Jakub silent in a way that was worse than whimpering, Milena spoke into the darkness. Her voice did not shake. It carried the flat finality of a woman who had reached a conclusion and would not be moved from it. I will not do this again. Not another winter in this box. If you cannot build something that holds warmth, we go back east. I will scrub floor in St. Louis before I watch my children freeze in a house you built. Karel lay still. The cabin cracked around them. The wind found a new gap in the chinking and sent a blade of cold air across the floor that made the candle flame on the shelf lean sideways and gutter. He did not answer Milena because the only answer that mattered was not a sentence. It was a house, a different house, a house that did not exist yet except in the place where his father's cellar walls still pressed cool against his memory in July and warm in January. He would build it. He would dig into the earth of Kansas the way he had dug into the hills of the old country. And he would wrap his family in the planet's own warmth. And the planet did not run out of fuel, did not crack in the night, did not let the wind through. But he could not build it now. Not in winter, not in frozen ground, not with tools that bounced off the iron-hard soil like hammers off an anvil. He would have to wait. He would have to survive this winter and the next in the failing cabin with the failing strategy. And the waiting would be its own kind of suffering, because he could see the answer and could not yet reach it. He lay awake on the worst nights, listening to the woodcrack, feeling the cold press through the buffalo robe that covered his family like a single shared skin. And he did not think about warmth. He thought about failure. Not the failure of his hands, which had built the cabin well enough. The joints were tight, the roof was sound, the chimney drew properly. The failure of his strategy. The cabin was not a bad cabin. It was the wrong answer to the wrong question. Every homesteader on the prairie was asking the same question. How do I keep the cold out? And every one of them was answering it the same way: build walls, seal cracks, burn fuel. And every one of them was losing the same war of attrition because the cold was bigger than any wall and more patient than any fire. And the question itself was wrong. The right question was not how to keep the cold out. The right question was how to never meet it in the first place. That was the thought that Karel Dvořák carried out of the winter of 1871, like a man carrying a coal from a dead fire. It glowed in his mind through the spring, through the summer, through the second winter which he endured in the same failing cabin, with the same failing strategy, because he was not yet ready to build what he saw in his mind. Because the vision needed time to become a plan, and the plan needed time to become specific enough to bet his family's lives on. By the spring of 1872, it was specific enough. He drew it for Milena first on a patch of bare ground behind the cabin using a stick. The drawing was simple: a rectangle sunk into the earth, roofed with timber and dirt, only one face exposed to the sky. Milena crouched beside him, Ruzhena leaning against her thigh, and studied the lines in the dirt with the intensity of a woman who understood that this drawing was not academic. This drawing was where her children would sleep. She was quiet for a long time. Karel waited. He'd learned that Milena's silences were not empty. They were full of thinking, and the thinking was usually better than his. Where does the water go? Karel's stick stopped mid-stroke. He looked at her. She was pointing at the drawing at the junction where the buried walls met the surface grade. Rain falls, snow melts, water runs downhill. Your house is the lowest point. Where does the water go? Karel looked at his drawing. Then he looked at his wife. Then he drew a trench around the perimeter of the rectangle. A drainage channel sloped away from the walls lined with gravel, emptying into a shallow swale 20 feet downhill. The kind of detail that separates a concept from a structure. The kind of detail that a man who'd spent his life building underground should have thought of first and hadn't, because he'd been thinking about heat and Milena had been thinking about water. And between the two of them, the house began to become real. Like a moat, Milena said. And there was the faintest edge of amusement in her voice, the kind of humor that surfaces only when someone realizes they're about to do something either brilliant or insane and can't tell which. A dry moat, Karel corrected. For a house that's a hole. For a house that's warm. The digging began in June. Karel worked alone most days because the other homesteaders were busy with their own land, their own crops, their own preparations for the winter. That was always coming, always arriving sooner than anyone expected. Milena helped when the children napped, hauling buckets of dirt up the ramp Karel had cut into the east wall of the excavation. Jakub helped too, carrying stones from the creek bed in a canvas sling, serious and silent, as though he understood that this work was different from the work other families did, and that the difference mattered. The foundation went in first limestone blocks, dry stacked 2 feet thick, 4 feet high from the floor of the hole. Karel fitted each block by hand, checking the faces the way a blind man reads text with his fingertips, feeling for the irregularities that would prevent a tight fit. The walls above the foundation were cottonwood timber, the same wood everyone else used. But Karel was not building walls the way everyone else built walls. He planed 3 faces of each log smooth, leaving the bark only on the interior face, the face that would become the inside wall of the house. He did not waste time with elaborate chinking between the logs because the logs were not the insulation. The logs were the skeleton. The insulation would be the earth itself. The frame went up fast once the foundation was done. Karel had spent 20 years building underground structures, and the engineering was in his hands. The way language is in a translator's mouth. The rear wall, the 2 side walls, the roof beams all cottonwood, all fitted tight, all angled to shed the weight of what was coming. He left the east-facing front wall open, framing it with heavier timbers to hold a door and 2 small windows. That one face east-facing, catching the morning light, sheltered from the prevailing northwest wind, would be the only part of the house visible to the world. Then came the part that made the neighbors certain he'd lost his mind. Karel began shoveling the excavated dirt back into the space between the timber walls and the earthen walls of the hole. Slowly, deliberately tamping each 6-inch layer with a heavy wooden post until the soil was dense as brick. He was burying his own house. He was taking the earth he had spent weeks removing and putting it back packed tight against the wood, filling the gap until the timber walls were pressed between the interior air and a solid mass of compacted earth 4 feet thick on each side and 6 feet thick at the rear. Harlan Creed came back in September when the 2 side walls had disappeared entirely under mounded dirt, and only the east-facing front and the stone chimney top were still visible. He stood where he'd stood in August, but the hole was gone now. In its place was a low grass-covered mound, with a wooden face like a hillside that had grown a door. Harlan dismounted this time. He walked the perimeter of the mound, testing the ground with his boot kicking at the packed earth. His face was the face of a man doing arithmetic and not liking the answer. "You've built a pressure wall, Dvořák." His voice was flat, practical, concerned. "First heavy rain, that dirt soaks up water swells and pushes your walls inward, or the frost heaves it upward. You've engineered your own collapse." Karel was on the roof, or rather, on the mound of dirt that was the roof, laying strips of prairie sod over the packed earth root side up, creating a living skin that would hold the soil in place. He straightened, leaned on the shovel, and looked down at Harlan with an expression that was not arrogant, and not defensive, and not apologetic. It was the expression of a man who'd heard this particular objection before in a different language from different men, and had outlived their predictions every time. "Earth is steady, it will hold." Harlan stared at him, waiting for more. More did not come. Karel went back to laying sod. Milena was beside the east wall, building up a low berm of grass-covered earth that would direct rainwater away from the door, the drainage system she'd insisted on from the beginning. She heard Harlan's warning, understood it in the practical terms of a woman who'd grown up around underground construction and knew what water did to buried walls when you let it accumulate. She spoke without stopping her work, and her voice carried the calm authority of someone stating a fact, not defending a position. "In the old country, the cellars my husband built stay drier than any house above ground. Packed earth doesn't let water through. The drainage moves it away before it ever reaches the walls. This soil is clay below 3 feet tighter than plaster." Harlan looked at her. In his experience, women on the frontier did not discuss construction engineering. But then in his experience, men on the frontier did not bury their houses in the ground. Aben Haight came by a few days later. He came alone this time, without Harlan on foot, which meant he'd walked the 1.5 miles from his place and could have had no other purpose for the walk than to see what Karel had built, or buried. The distinction was not yet clear. The house was nearly finished. The mound rose gently from the prairie, covered in fresh sod that was already beginning to knit into the existing grass. The chimney jutted up from the crown like a stone finger, and the single east-facing wall of timber sat under a slight overhang of earth, the door and 2 small windows looking out across the tall grass toward the creek. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd think it was a natural rise, a wrinkle in the prairie skin, not a house, not a structure of any kind, just land. Eben stood in front of the door for a long time. His hands were in his pockets. His face did something complicated, a series of small adjustments, like a man trying on expressions and finding none of them adequate. Milena saw him from where she was hanging laundry on the line she'd strung between 2 posts near the chimney. She walked over, drying her hands on her apron. She was not a woman who feared silence, but she understood that Eben's silence was not the comfortable kind. "Come inside and see. Karel is at the creek getting water, but the house speaks for itself." Eben took a step back. The movement was involuntary, the kind of recoil that comes from somewhere deeper than decision. "I don't go underground while I'm still breathing." He turned and walked away, fast. His boots crushed the new sod, leaving heel prints in Karel's roof. Milena watched him go. She did not call after him, did not shrug, did not dismiss the strange intensity of his refusal. She stood there with her hands still damp, looking at the place where Eben had stood. And she understood in the way that women on the frontier understood things about their neighbor's grief, without being told that Eben Haight was not afraid of the house. He was afraid of what the house meant. If it worked, it meant something else had failed. And whatever had failed, it had cost Eben something he could not get back. She went inside and told Karel when he returned. Karel said nothing but that evening, fitting the last strip of sod on the south slope of the roof. He paused and looked east toward Eben's quarter section, where a single light burned in a cabin window. Just one light, because Eben had lived alone for 5 years, and the cabin was built for 2. The house was finished by the end of September. From the outside, it had effectively ceased to exist. A grass-covered mound, low and gentle, rising no more than 4 feet above the surrounding prairie. A stone chimney, a wooden face with a heavy door and 2 glass-paned windows, both small, both set deep in the timber wall. No porch, no fence, no ornament. The structure made no announcement of itself. It simply merged with the ground the way a burrow merges with a hillside, the way a den merges with a creek bank. The land had absorbed it, and from any distance at all, the house was invisible. The neighbors gave it names. The Bohemians' Gopher Hole, the Prairie Dog Palace, the Dvořák's Root Cellar. The names were jokes, but beneath the jokes was unease, the discomfort of people who've built their homes one way and now see someone build his another, and cannot quite explain why the difference feels like a criticism. Inside the house was a single room 30 feet by 18 with a packed earth floor, whitewashed timber walls and a ceiling of cottonwood beams overlaid with planks, overlaid with packed earth, overlaid with sod. The ceiling was low 6.5 feet, and the 2 windows admitted light, but not much of it. Milena had placed the kitchen work along the east wall near the windows and the sleeping area, along the west wall deep against the earth. A small cast-iron stove sat in the northeast corner, its pipe running up through the ceiling and into the stone chimney. The stove was half the size of Harlan Creed's fireplace, and Karel had bought it second-hand from Walt Sutter for $2 and a promise of labor, and Walt had thought he was getting the better deal. The science of what Karel had built was not something he could explain in the language of textbooks, because he had never read a textbook on the subject. He understood it the way his father had understood it, and his father's father, before that as a truth of the hands, a knowledge that lived in the fingertips pressed against cool stone in the middle of summer. But the science was real, and it was simple, and it was the reason the house would do what no cabin on the prairie could do. Consider a bar of iron left in the Kansas sun. Thin, dark, dense, it heats in minutes hot enough to brand skin. Its mass is small relative to its surface. Energy floods in and has nowhere to hide. Now consider a boulder 1,000 pounds of limestone sitting in the same sun. After an hour, the surface is warm. Below the surface, cool. After a day, the warmth has penetrated perhaps an inch. The mass is enormous relative to the surface, and the energy is absorbed so slowly that the temperature barely changes. That is thermal mass, the resistance of large bodies to temperature, change the stubbornness of anything big enough and dense enough to absorb energy without flinching. The Earth is the largest thermal mass a builder can use because it is for all practical purposes infinite. Below the frost line, 4 feet down in Flint Hills, the soil maintains a temperature of approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Not warm, not cold, steady, permanent, indifferent to the 95-degree days of August and the 10 below zero nights of January. The Earth has its own climate, and its climate does not change with the seasons, because the seasons are shallow, thin disturbances on the surface of a body so massive that the disturbances never reach its core. Harlan Creed's cabin sat on the surface of the earth, exposed to the full fury of the Kansas winter. Interior temperature 70 degrees maintained by constant fire. Exterior temperature on a bad night -10. Temperature difference the walls had to resist 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Every inch of those walls was a battlefield, and the cold was winning every minute of every day, because wood is a poor soldier against a siege that never lifts. Karel Dvořák's house was buried in the earth. 3 walls and the roof were surrounded by 4 to 6 feet of compacted soil at a constant 50 degrees. Interior temperature 70 degrees, maintained by a small stove burning a fraction of the fuel. Temperature difference those walls had to resist 20 degrees, not 80, 20, a reduction of 75%. The earth was not merely blocking the cold. The earth was actively warming the walls of the house, pushing heat inward from every direction, except the single exposed face which Karel had oriented east to catch the morning sun and sheltered from the northwest wind that carried the worst of the winter. Karel had not insulated his house. He had embedded it in an insulation so vast it could never be exhausted. He had wrapped his family in the planet's own warmth, and the planet did not run out of fuel, did not need to be fed, logs did not crack in the night or let the wind through. The planet simply held steady, the way it had held steady for 4 billion years. And Karel's genius. If genius is the right word for a man applying knowledge that was ancient when Rome was young, was recognizing that the warmth was already there beneath his feet, waiting to be borrowed. November came in cold and quick. The first snow fell on the 14th, a thin dusting that melted by noon, and then a real snow on the 17th, 6 inches that stayed. The prairie turned white. The tall grass bent under the weight and disappeared. The world became a blank page, and the only writing on it was smoke. Harlan Creed's chimney poured thick grey columns into the sky from before dawn until after dark. The fireplace roared and consumed wood the way a furnace consumes coal constantly, enormously, insatiably. The cabin glowed with firelight in the windows, and from a distance it looked warm, but warmth and the appearance of warmth were not the same thing. Inside, Harlan and Della and their children lived in a circle 10 feet in diameter around the fire, because beyond that circle the temperature dropped into the 40s, and in the corners of the cabin where the walls met frost, grew on the chinking like white moss. Karel's chimney gave off a single pale wisp so faint against the overcast sky that you had to know where to look to see it at all. Inside the mound, the stove burned 2 small logs in the morning and 2 in the evening. The temperature, held at 68 degrees without effort, without vigilance, without the desperate, exhausting, wood-devouring fight that defined winter in every other home on the prairie. Jakub and Ruzena played on the packed earth floor in wool stockings and cotton shirts. No coats, no blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Milena worked at the kitchen table with bare hands, kneading dough-mending clothes, writing a letter to her sister that she would not be able to mail until spring. The butter in the crock was soft. The water in the bucket was liquid. The air smelled like bread and wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of earth. The only complaint, and Milena made it gently, because she was not a woman who complained, but a woman who identified problems, was the darkness. The 2 small windows let in the pale winter light, but by mid-afternoon the interior was dim, and by 4 o'clock Milena was lighting the oil lamp, and the lamp gave good light but burned oil that cost money. Karel heard the complaint for what it was, not criticism but engineering feedback, and filed it away. The next house would have a skylight. This house was a first draft, and first drafts are allowed their imperfections. Outside the temperature dropped and dropped and kept dropping. A curl of wood smoke drifted upward from the mound on the Flint Hills prairie, barely distinguishable from the fog of a man's breath. And inside the earth, Karel Dvořák's family lived as though winter were a rumor happening to someone else. January arrived not as a month, but as an occupation. The cold that had settled over the Flint Hills in November had been exploratory, tentative, testing the walls, probing the seams, learning the weaknesses. The cold of January knew the weaknesses already. It came in with authority, with wind that moved at 40 miles per hour across a landscape that offered nothing to slow it, and temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there with the patience of something that intended to remain. The prairie became hostile in ways that had nothing to do with temperature alone. The wind was the real weapon, a constant horizontal force that found every gap in every structure, that drove snow sideways through cracks too small to see, that made the simple act of walking to a well or a woodpile into an ordeal, measured not in distance, but in endurance. Skin exposed for more than a few minutes went numb, then white, then began to die. The air hurt to breathe. Cattle stood with their backs to the wind, motionless, conserving heat with the grim efficiency of animals that had been bred on this land for exactly this purpose and were still barely managing. Harlan Creed's cabin became a fortress under siege, and like all fortresses under siege, it was losing. The fireplace consumed wood at a rate that turned his carefully stacked supply into a dwindling monument to miscalculation. He had cut and split 4 cords in the autumn enough. He'd calculated for the worst winter Kansas could produce. By the 3rd week of January, 2.5 cords were gone. The mathematics were simple and merciless. At the current rate of consumption, he would run out of fuel before February. And February was the cruelest month, the month that killed people who'd survived everything else. Della Crede managed the interior with the grim competence of a quartermaster's wife, which he was. The family slept in a single bed, pushed to within 5 feet of the fireplace, all 4 of them under every blanket and hide they owned. She rationed the dried beans and salt pork, portioned the flour for biscuits that were more architecture than cooking. Dense, heavy, designed to fill stomachs rather than please palates. Water came from snow melted in the iron pot, a slow process that produced a metallic-tasting liquid that was never quite enough. The children had stopped complaining about the cold the way soldiers stopped complaining about mud. Not because it had improved, but because complaint required energy they could no longer spare. Eben Haight's cabin, smaller and occupied by 1 man instead of a family, should have been easier to heat. It was not. A single body produces less warmth than 4, and Eben's cabin had been built for 2 for himself and Martha, who had been dead for 5 winters, and whose absence was most present in January when the empty half of the bed radiated cold like a second window. He burned his wood slowly, methodically, the way a man drinks the last of his water in a desert, knowing that conservation only delays the inevitable, but unable to do anything else. He ate cold biscuits and jerky. He did not cook because cooking required fire, and fire required wood, and wood required the future to be longer than the present. And in January, Eben was not certain of that. Mid-January brought a day of relative calm, wind dropping to 10 miles per hour. Temperature climbing to a balmy 5 above zero, and the settlement exhaled. People emerged from their cabins the way animals emerge from burrows after a storm, blinking cautious, hungry for something other than their own 4 walls. Harlan hitched his mare and rode to Walt Sutter's store, driven by a need that was partly practical. He was low on coffee and partly psychological. He needed to see other faces. He needed to confirm that the world beyond his cabin still existed. Eben was already there when Harlan arrived, standing by the pot-bellied stove, with his hands wrapped around a tin cup of Walt's coffee, which was terrible and hot and therefore perfect. 2 other homesteaders, younger men, brothers from Ohio, whose names Harlan could never keep straight, sat on flour barrels near the window chewing tobacco and saying nothing. The store smelled like kerosene leather coffee and the particular musk of men who had not bathed in weeks, because bathing required warm water, and warm water required fuel, and fuel was life. Walt stood behind the counter ledger, open spectacles at their customary angle. He pushed them up when Harlan came in, pushed them up again 12 seconds later. Harlan bought a pound of coffee and a tin of molasses. He paid on credit, which Walt noted without comment. Then Harlan asked the question that had been building in his chest for 3 weeks, the question he could not have articulated as anything more than an itch, until this moment standing in a room with other men who were burning through their wood supplies the same way he was. Walt Dvořák, when did he last buy firewood? Walt's pen stopped. He flipped back through the ledger page by page, his finger tracing the entries with the precision of a man who trusted records more than memory. The pages whispered, the stove ticked. Outside, a horse stamped. October, half a quart. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of arithmetic, full of disbelief, full of the slow grinding sound of certainty being revised. Harlan had burned 4 cords and was running out. Karel Dvořák had purchased half a cord 3 months ago. Eben set his coffee down. His voice, when it came, was stripped of the casual cruelty that usually armored it. Maybe they're freezing in that hole and nobody knows. Walt closed the ledger. His eyes moved to the window, to the white expanse of prairie visible through the frost-patterned glass. Chimney smokes every morning, thin but steady. Whatever he's doing in there, he's not dead. The brothers from Ohio exchanged a glance. Harlan picked up his coffee, and Molasses put them in his saddlebag and left without another word. But the number half a chord rode home with him, and it sat in his mind the way a stone sits in a boot, impossible to ignore, impossible to explain, impossible to remove without stopping everything and dealing with it. 3 days later, the Chinook came. It arrived from the southwest, warm and wet, a wind from a different world. In 4 hours, the temperature climbed 50 degrees. By noon, the prairie was weeping snow dissolving into meltwater that ran in braided channels across the frozen ground, pooling in every depression, turning the white world brown and then muddy green as the ghost of grass reappeared beneath the retreating snow. The sky turned the color of pewter, low and heavy with moisture, and the air smelled like spring, like thawing earth and wet stone, and the faint, impossible sweetness of growth. The homesteaders responded the way prisoners respond to an unexpected reprieve. Children poured out of cabins, splashing in meltwater, faces lifted to a sky that no longer felt like a ceiling. Women opened doors and windows, airing out rooms that had been sealed for weeks. Rooms that smelled of wood smoke and bodies and the sour tang of confinement. Men walked their properties, checking fences, counting cattle, assessing damage, and finding damage everywhere. The freeze-thaw cycle had split fence posts. Ice had heaved stones out of foundations. Cattle had lost weight, their ribs showing through winter coats that were matted with frozen mud. Inside the cabins, the Chinook revealed a different kind of damage. The cottonwood walls, subjected to weeks of frost, now absorbed the warm, wet air like sponges. Moisture beaded on interior surfaces ran down the walls, pooled on floors. The mud and grass chinking, which had frozen into brittle cement, softened back into mud. Ceiling boards sweated. Harlan's cabin wept from every surface, and the fireplace, which he had damped down in the sudden warmth, hissed and sputtered as moisture found the hot stone. Inside Karel Dvořák's house, nothing happened, nothing at all. The temperature remained 68 degrees, the same as it had been in December, the same as it had been in the worst week of January. The walls were dry, the floor was dry. The air held no moisture beyond what Milena's cooking pot contributed. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth was so enormous, its temperature so deeply established, that 4 days of warm wind were as significant to it as a match held against a boulder. The Chinook could not penetrate the mound. The warmth outside could not reach the coolness locked in the surrounding soil, and the coolness could not reach the warmth locked inside the house. And the house existed in a state of thermal equilibrium so stable that the seasons were reduced to something observed through 2 small windows rather than endured through 4 thin walls. Milena noticed it. She stood at the east window on the second day of the Chinook, watching meltwater stream past the drainage channel she'd designed, and she understood with the satisfaction of a woman whose practical question had become a practical answer that the drainage was working. The water flowed around the house, not into it. The gravel-lined channel carried it downslope into the swale where it pooled and soaked into the earth and was gone. The house was a stone in a river, unmoved, untouched. She did not celebrate. She noted the fact and returned to her work, which was mending Yakub's second pair of trousers, because the boy had 1 pair that was wearing thin and 1 pair that was too small, and neither situation would resolve itself. The Chinook lasted 4 days. On the morning of the 5th day, it stopped. The wind simply ceased, as though someone had closed a door, and for an hour the prairie was still a held breath. A silence so complete that Harlan Creed, stepping outside to check his horses, heard his own heartbeat in his ears. Then the north wind came. It came not gradually, but all at once, a wall of air so cold it felt solid, and the temperature dropped 60 degrees in 12 hours, and everything that had melted froze not back into snow, but into ice. Clear, dense, impenetrable ice. The meltwater that had pooled in every low spot became a skating rink. The saturated ground became a sheet of glass. Every blade of grass, every fence post, every rope and rail and exposed surface was encased in a shell of ice that caught the thin winter sun and threw it back in blinding, beautiful, useless light. The world became crystal, and crystal was a prison. Inside the cabins, the consequences of the Chinook revealed themselves with methodical cruelty. The cottonwood walls, saturated with moisture during the warm days, now froze solid. Not frozen the way they had been before, dry wood contracting in cold air. This was different. This was wet wood turning to ice, expanding as it froze, splitting fibers, cracking joints, opening gaps that the original construction had sealed. The walls of Harlan's cabin groaned through the first night of the refreeze, with sounds that reminded Della of a ship she'd once heard about that had been crushed by ice in the Arctic, a slow, organic, agonizing compression that sounded almost alive. The chinking, which had softened to mud during the Chinook, froze into a brittle, crumbling paste that fell away from the gaps in chunks, letting in blades of air so cold they were visible, actual columns of condensation marking the paths of infiltration like tracer fire. Harlan spent the first day stuffing rags into the gaps, but the rags froze too, and by the second day, he'd given up on the walls and focused everything on the fire, which now had to fight not just the outside temperature, but the walls themselves, which had become conductors of cold rather than barriers against it. The ice siege lasted 28 days, 28 days in which the ground was ungovernable. Too slick for wagons, too treacherous for horses without crampons, too dangerous for cattle to cross to reach the grass frozen beneath the glaze. The homesteaders entered a state of confinement that was not quite imprisonment, but shared its essential characteristics. Limited movement, limited supplies, limited contact with the world beyond their walls, and the slow, corrosive psychological pressure of endurance without a visible end. The first week was manageable. Every household had stored provisions in the fall: dried beans, salt pork flour, cornmeal, potatoes, buried in root cellars, onions braided and hung from rafters. Water came from ice chipped off the creek and melted on the stove. The cattle ate hay stored in lean-tos adjacent to the barns. The humans ate, slept, maintained their fires, and waited. The second week, the hay began to run low. Harlan had stored his hay supply in a covered rick a quarter-mile from the cabin, close enough for summer convenience, far enough to be a serious problem now. His cattle penned in the barn had consumed what he'd kept nearby and were beginning to bawl, a low, constant, miserable sound that carried through the ice-sealed walls and into the cabin, where it became the soundtrack of a crisis approaching. Eben Haight killed his weakest calf on the 9th day. He did it in his barn out of the wind with a single stroke of the axe that was more mercy than slaughter. The calf had stopped eating and was standing with its head down, its breath coming in shallow, rapid clouds, its legs trembling. Eben butchered it on the barn floor, hung the quarters from the rafters where the cold would keep them, and did not waste time on grief. The meat would last him 3 weeks. The calf would not have lasted 3 days. That night, the 9th night, Eben lay in his bed and listened to the wind and heard the familiar sound he'd been dreading since the freeze began. The cabin logs cracking, sharp percussive reports like distant gunfire as the frozen wood contracted and split along its grain. The sound came at irregular intervals, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes seconds, and each crack sent a vibration through the frame that Eben felt in his spine. He had heard this sound before. January of 1868. Martha beside him coughing, the cabin making its death sounds, while his wife made hers, and Eben stoking the fire until his face blistered, and the air at the ceiling was hot enough to bake bread, and the air at the floor was cold enough to freeze the water in the bucket. And Martha coughing, and the logs cracking, and Eben understanding with a clarity that felt like a knife that the cabin was not going to save her, because the cabin could not save itself, and neither could he. He did not sleep. When dawn came gray and reluctant, he went to the window. The glass so thick with frost he had to scrape it with his thumbnail to see through, and looked out across the prairie. Karel Dvořák's mound was visible from Eben's cabin, a low shape against the white, unremarkable, except for one detail that Eben had been watching every morning for weeks, without acknowledging what it meant. The chimney. a pale filament of smoke lifting into the frozen air, with the same unhurried consistency it had shown since November. Not desperate, not frantic, not the billowing of a household burning through its reserves. Just a filament, patient, constant, as though the house beneath it were not engaged in the same war everyone else was fighting. Eben watched the smoke for a long time. His breath made its own fog against the cold glass obscuring his view, and he wiped it with his sleeve and watched again. The thought that had been circling the perimeter of his mind for weeks, staying outside, not permitted entry, finally stepped through the door. If that house is really warm, if it really works the way he claims, then Martha died. Because I didn't know how to build a proper shelter. Eben closed his eyes, pressed his forehead against the frozen glass. The cold burned his skin and he let it. He did not allow himself to finish the thought. On the 15th day, Harlan Creed ran out of options. The cattle were starving. The hay rick sat a quarter-mile south, stacked with enough feed to last another month if he could reach it. The ice glaze that covered the ground had partially melted and refrozen twice, creating a surface that was neither smooth enough to slide across nor rough enough to walk on with confidence. Horses could not keep their footing. Men could barely by shuffling in short steps, but a man cannot carry 100 pounds of hay while shuffling. Harlan decided on the wagon. 2 horses, the strongest, he had hooked to the flatbed with a short tongue. He would drive them slow, keep the weight centered, follow the low ground where snow had accumulated over the ice and provided some traction. He told Della he'd be back in 2 hours. She did not argue. She understood the arithmetic as well as he did. The cattle would die without feed, and dead cattle meant dead family. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon enough. The trip out worked. Harlan reached the rick, loaded the wagon with 4 bales, lashed them down. The horses stood steaming their breath, pluming in the still air, their hooves crunching through the thin crust of snow into the ice beneath. The sun was low and white and gave no warmth. The trip back began well. Harlan kept the horses at a walk, the wagon creaking along the low ground, the bales stacked and stable. He was a quarter-mile from home, passing the western slope of Currell's Mound. He could see the chimney smoke, could smell something that might have been bread baking when the ground tilted. Not much, a gentle slope, a rise of perhaps 3 feet over 20 yards, barely noticeable in summer. But the slope was glazed ice beneath a dusting of snow, and the wagon loaded with 400 pounds of hay began to slide sideways. Harlan pulled the reins left, trying to straighten the trajectory. The horses felt the wagon pushing them and lunged, and the lunge changed the angle, and the right front wheel dropped into a shallow rut masked by ice, and the axle snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. The wagon lurched, tilted, and stopped. The horses scrambled, hooves sparking on ice, the broken tongue dragging. Harlan was thrown from the seat, but landed on his feet, an old soldier's reflex, the body remembering what the mind has forgotten. He stood on the ice, steady, assessing. The wagon was done. 1 axle broken, 1 wheel cocked at an angle that meant the hub was cracked too. The hay bales had tumbled off the high side and lay scattered on the ice like enormous dice. He could unhitch the horses and ride one home. He could leave the hay and come back with tools. He could do the sensible thing. But the sensible thing required walking a quarter-mile on ice, and the wind was picking up, and the temperature was dropping as the sun disappeared behind a bank of cloud that looked like a bruise, and Harlan Creed was 50 yards from the only shelter between here and his cabin. The smoke curled from the chimney, unhurried, indifferent to irony. Harlan looked at it. He looked at his cabin, a distant shape with a big chimney pouring smoke. He looked at the ice under his boots. He looked at his hands, which were shaking inside his gloves, not from cold alone, but from something closer to exhaustion, the accumulated weight of weeks spent fighting a battle he could not win with tools he did not trust. He unhitched the horses, tied them to the heavy wagon frame, where they'd be out of the direct wind, and began walking toward the mound. Each step was deliberate, heel first, testing the surface before committing weight. The wind pushed at his back as though the prairie itself were directing him. He reached the east face of the mound, the wooden wall, the heavy door. 2 small windows glowing with warm light that looked from out here like something from a painting. like a scene from a life that could not possibly exist 50 yards from the broken wagon and the dying light, and the wind that was starting to moan across the ice. Harlan Creed raised his fist to knock and paused. Behind this door was everything he'd mocked. Behind this door was the proof that he'd been wrong, not about a trivial thing, not about a matter of taste or opinion, but about the fundamental question of how to survive in this place. He had been wrong, and his family had suffered for his wrongness, and the evidence of his error was about to open the door and offer him coffee. His knuckles hit the wood 3 times, each knock harder than the last, as though he were trying to break through more than a door. Carl opened it, backlit by lamplight, and the glow of the small stove and a wave of air rolled over Harlan Creed, like a physical thing, warm, dry, still. The air smelled of baking bread and linseed oil, and the clean mineral scent of whitewash. It was not the blast of a roaring fireplace, not the aggressive temporary heat of a fire fighting a losing battle. It was ambient, settled, permanent. The air of a room that had been warm for so long it had forgotten what cold was. Harlan stepped inside, and the world changed. The wind, which had been a constant presence for so long that Harlan's ears had stopped registering it as sound, vanished. Not diminished, not muffled, gone. The earth-packed walls absorbed it completely, and the silence that replaced it was so total that Harlan heard his own pulse, heard the tick of cooling metal from the stovepipe, heard Ruzhena humming something tuneless and private from the corner where she sat with a rag doll. Jakub looked up from the floor where he was arranging wooden blocks into a structure that bore a suspicious resemblance to his father's mound. The boy wore cotton rolled past his elbows, bare forearms resting on the floor as casually as if it were July. His feet in wool stockings rested on the packed earth floor, as though the floor were not made of the same substance that was killing cattle a quarter-mile away. Milena stood at the kitchen table near the east windows, her hands white with flour, a strand of dark hair escaping the cloth she'd tied around her head. She looked at Harlan the way she looked at most things, directly, without evasion, without the performative surprise that social convention might have called for. She simply nodded, reached for a tin cup, and poured coffee from the pot on the stove. Harlan took the cup. His hands were shaking badly enough that the coffee trembled in the cup, and he watched the dark surface quiver, and could not decide if he was shaking from cold or from something else, from the slow seismic shift of understanding that was happening in a place deeper than his muscles. He drank. The coffee was hot, bitter, and good, and it went down into his chest and met the warmth already there. The warmth of the room, the warmth of the earth, the warmth that was not struggling to exist but simply existing. The way stone exists, the way bedrock exists, the way the planet exists beneath the thin, violent, temporary disruptions of weather. He looked around the room. The whitewashed walls reflecting the lamplight made the space feel larger than its dimensions. No frost on any surface, no moisture beading on the ceiling, no rags stuffed into gaps, no wind-driven snow dust in the corners, no ice forming on the interior walls. The stove, that absurdly small stove, half the size of his fireplace, sat in the corner, glowing with a bed of embers so low they barely colored the iron. Its second and final feeding of the day was already winding down, its modest consumption of fuel almost spent. Harlan counted the pieces of wood stacked beside it, without meaning, to the quartermaster's habit, as involuntary as breathing. 14 pieces. He burned 14 pieces before breakfast. Karel had settled back into a chair near the stove, his hands wrapped around his own cup, watching Harlan with the patience of a man who has no need to speak because the room is making every argument for him. And then Harlan saw it. On a small wooden shelf mortised directly into the earthen wall, a shelf cut from a single plank and fitted into the packed soil as naturally as a root fits into the ground. A lump of bread dough sat under a clean linen cloth. The cloth was slightly tented, pushed upward by the mass beneath it. The dough was rising, visibly, actively, unmistakably rising, the yeast alive and working, converting sugar to gas, expanding the gluten matrix in the steady warmth that surrounded it. Harlan stared at the dough the way a man stares at a verdict. In his cabin, dough did not rise in January. In his cabin, the yeast went dormant within an hour of mixing. killed by cold that penetrated every corner the fire couldn't reach. Della had stopped trying to bake leavened bread in December and switched to biscuits and flatbread dense and unleavened because leavening required warmth. And warmth in Harlan's cabin was a territory that shrank every time the fire died down, a besieged perimeter that could not hold. The dough on Karl's shelf did not know it was January. The dough on Karl's shelf existed in the same perpetual temperate calm that everything in this room existed in the children, the butter, the water, the air itself. The shelf was made of earth. The wall was made of earth. The earth was warm. The dough was rising. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary domestic unremarkable thing. Bread dough doing what bread dough does when you leave it in a warm place. And yet in the context of a winter that had frozen water in buckets, killed cattle, split wood, cracked leather, and driven an entire community into a state of armed siege against the sky, it was the most extraordinary thing Harlan Creed had ever seen. It was proof, not argument, not theory, not the stubborn assertion of a man who refused to listen to advice. Proof. Physical, biological, irrefutable proof that the earth beneath their feet was not cold, that the cold was only a surface, only a skin, only the thinnest possible layer of hostility stretched over a warmth so deep and permanent that bread could rise on it in the dead of January. Harlan's fingers tightened around the tin cup until his knuckles went white. His eyes moved from the dough to Karl. The dough is rising. Karl looked at the shelf, then back at Harlan. His expression did not change. It is warm here. They sat in silence for an hour. Harlan drank 2 cups of coffee. He watched Milena shape the risen dough into loaves. Her hands quick, confident, working with a material that responded to her touch. The way it was supposed to respond, the way it could only respond in a room where the temperature never varied. He watched the children play on the floor without shivering. He watched the stove sit quietly in its corner, its modest work for the day complete its consumption of fuel so small it seemed almost ceremonial compared to the ravenous appetite of Harlan's fireplace. He did not ask questions. He did not request explanations. He was not a man who needed things explained. He was a man who needed things demonstrated, and the demonstration was complete. Every surface in this room, every object, every person, every breath of air was evidence. The room was its own argument, and the argument was irrefutable. And Harlan Creed, who had survived Vicksburg by knowing when to change supply lines, who had survived 3 Kansas winters, by adapting faster than the men who didn't recognize the moment for what it was, the instant when new information makes old strategy obsolete. Karl walked him out when the light began to fail. They went together to the wagon, 2 men moving carefully on the ice, and Karel helped lead the horses from the broken frame to the leeward side of his mound, where the earth wall broke the wind and the ground was softer. And Harlan noticed that Karel's boots left prints in actual dirt, not ice, not frozen mud, but dirt that was merely cool, warmed from beneath by the same thermal mass that warmed the house. "I'll send my boy with the sledge in the morning," Karel offered. "We can drag the hay bales back to your barn." Harlan nodded. He mounted the mare bareback, the other horse on a lead, and turned toward home. His face in the last light was set in an expression that was not defeat and not gratitude and not anger. It was the face of a man recalculating, rebuilding the model of the world from the foundation up, because the old foundation had just been proven hollow. He rode away without looking back. Eben Haight saw him. Eben had been standing at his window again. His habit now, the one thing he did every evening besides feed the fire and eat cold meat and not think about Martha. He scraped the frost from the glass with his thumbnail and watched the prairie in the last gray light. And he saw Harlan Creed riding east from the direction of Karl's mound. Not from the direction of the hay rick, not from the direction of the cottonwood road, from the mound. Eben watched until Harlan disappeared into the dusk. Then he stood at the window a long time, his breath fogging the glass, his thumbnail resting against the frost he'd scraped away. The chimney smoke was invisible now, lost in the darkness, but Eben knew it was there. a ghost of combustion barely visible from a house that needed almost nothing to stay warm, because it had been built by a man who understood that the earth was not the enemy. If I had known, if I had built like that, if Martha had lived through that winter in a house that was warm, not hot, not blazing, not the desperate, devouring heat of a fire that can never be enough, just warm. Warm the way the earth is warm, warm enough for bread to rise. Eben closed his eyes, pressed his forehead against the glass. The cold burned, and this time he pulled back. He went to bed. He did not sleep. In the darkness, the logs cracked and split with sounds like small bones breaking, and Eben lay still and listened to his cabin die around him. And he allowed himself for the first time in 5 years to think the thought he'd been running from since August, since the day he'd looked into Karel's hole and felt the ground shift under his certainty. Karel was right, and Martha is dead. He lay with the thought until dawn, and dawn came grey and ice-sealed and bitter, and the smoke rose from the mound on the hill, and Eben Haight watched it from his window and understood that something had changed in him during the night. Something load-bearing had cracked, and the structure it supported would never be the same. The ice broke on the 14th of February, not with drama, but with exhaustion. The siege did not end so much as it simply stopped the way a fever stops. Not because the body has won, but because the illness has spent itself. The temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in 28 days, and the glaze that had imprisoned the prairie began to weep, then crack, then dissolve into a million small rivers that braided across the land and carried the winter's cruelty downhill into the creeks which swelled and ran, brown and loud with the sound of release. The grass came back in patches, emerging from beneath the retreating ice like something resurrected, pale and flattened, but alive, impossibly alive, bending toward a sun that had remembered how to give warmth. The cattle released from barns that stank of confinement walked stiff-legged onto ground that gave beneath their hooves actual ground, actual dirt, and they lowered their heads and began to eat with a desperation that was painful to watch. Harlan Creed counted his herd and found 2 missing dead in the barn during the final week, too weak to stand, their bodies frozen against the back wall, where they'd pressed themselves trying to find warmth that did not exist. The homesteaders emerged into a landscape that looked like a battlefield after the armies have withdrawn. Fence posts split and leaning, roof sod peeled back by ice, wood piles reduced to scattered remnants. Every cabin bore the scars of the siege, chinking gaps stuffed with rags and straw window glass cracked by thermal stress door frames, warped by the freeze-thaw-freeze cycle that the Chinook had inflicted. The settlement looked tired. The people looked older than they had in November, aged not by months, but by the particular kind of time that passes when every hour is spent in resistance. Karel Dvořák's mound looked better than it had in autumn. The sod roof, watered by snowmelt and warmed from below by the house's residual heat, had begun to green before any other grass on the prairie. The drainage channel Milena had designed carried the meltwater in a clean arc around the perimeter, depositing it in the swale downslope where it soaked into the earth and fed the roots of bluestem that would grow tall enough by summer to hide the mound entirely. The house was healing itself with the land knitting back into the prairie as though it had never been a wound. March came wet and temperamental. April followed with wind and the first wildflowers shooting stars and prairie violets pushing through the mat of dead grass. And by May the settlement had turned its attention to planting, to rebuilding, to the 1,000 urgent tasks that spring demands of people who live by the calendar of the soil. The winter receded in memory the way all Kansas winters recede, not forgotten, but filed, stored in the body's archive of endurance, available for reference but no longer acute. Della Creed came to visit Milena on a morning in late April, when the cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out, and the air smelled of mud and pollen, and the distant possibility of summer. She brought a small sack of flour, good flour white, purchased from Walt Sutter with the last of the winter's egg money. And she brought a notebook, not a fancy thing, A composition book with a marbled cover, the kind schoolchildren used. Its pages ruled in blue and blank, except for the first page where Harlan Creed's handwriting. Small, precise, the handwriting of a man who'd kept supply ledgers for a living, had written a list of questions. Della stood at Carl's door, the flower in one hand and the notebook in the other, and the posture of her body told its own story, straight-backed, composed, but with a tightness in her jaw that came from delivering a message that cost her husband something to send. Mr. Creed is making plans for a new structure on our property. He'd be obliged if Mr. Dvorak could share the wall dimensions and roof thickness of this house. Milena took the flower, took the notebook, and understood everything that was not being said. Harlan Creed was not building a smokehouse. Harlan Creed was building a home, or planning to, and the fact that he'd sent his wife instead of coming himself was not cowardice. It was the particular grammar of pride on the frontier, where a man could change his mind about everything except the appearance of having changed his mind. Sending Della was Harlan's way of saying, I was wrong, and I'm acting on it, and I will not pretend otherwise, but I will not stand in front of the man I mocked and ask for his blueprints. A wife could carry that message. A wife could translate surrender into a social call. Milena did not comment on any of this. She set the flower on the kitchen shelf and opened the notebook and looked at Harlan's questions, which were thorough, specific, and revealed a mind that had spent the week since January thinking about nothing else. Wall thickness, roof depth, drainage gradient, foundation specifications, timber species and treatment, ventilation. She did not answer the questions from the notebook. Instead, she took Della's arm and walked her through the house, the way you walk someone through a garden, pointing, explaining, touching. She began with the drainage channel, leading Della outside to the perimeter trench, crouching beside it, showing how the gravel bed sloped 2 inches per foot away from the walls and emptied into the swale. This was the first thing I asked Karel about. Where does the water go? If you don't answer that question before you dig, you're building a cistern, not a home. She picked up a handful of the gravel, let it run through her fingers. Creek gravel, wash clean, doesn't hold moisture, it channels it. Inside, she showed Della the earthen shelves built directly into the packed walls. Shallow alcoves where butter stayed soft, where milk stayed cool in summer and unfrozen in winter, where bread dough rose on a surface that held 50 degrees, regardless of what the sky was doing. She showed her the 2 windows set deep in the timber wall, angled slightly downward to catch low winter sun, and slightly inward to reduce heat loss. She showed her the stove placement northeast corner pipe running through the ceiling at the mound's highest point, drawing air from the floor and exhausting it through the chimney in a circulation pattern that distributed warmth evenly without drafts. Della wrote in the notebook with a pencil stub, her handwriting looser than Harlan's, but more detailed. She drew diagrams. She noted measurements that Milena provided by pacing 6 paces wide, 10 paces long arm span from floor to ceiling beam. These were not the units of an engineer. They were the units of a woman who lived in the space and knew it the way you know your own body, not by numbers but by fit. The 2 women stood at the kitchen table afterward, and Della asked one question that was not in Harlan's notebook. Were you afraid when he started digging? When the neighbors talked? Were you afraid he was wrong? Milena considered this. She poured coffee, the last of the winter supply, thin and precious, and held her cup with both hands. And her answer, when it came, was not the answer Della expected. I was afraid of the water, not the idea. The idea I understood. I grew up watching cellars being built. Earth holds heat. This is not new, it is very old. But water underground is a different enemy than water above ground. If the drainage failed, we would drown before we froze. She paused. The drainage did not fail. Della nodded. She closed the notebook. She looked around the room one more time, the whitewashed walls, the earthen floor. The shelf where a linen cloth tented upward over the slow, patient work of yeast and warmth. And she said something that she had not planned to say, something that surfaced from the part of her that had spent January watching her children shiver. I wish we'd listened sooner. Milena touched her hand. Briefly, the way frontier women touched each other, quickly, without ceremony, carrying in the gesture everything that words would have made sentimental. You're listening now. Della left with the notebook full of diagrams and a small jar of Milena's sourdough starter. Because Milena understood that the gift of bread was more persuasive than the gift of information. And because a woman who could bake leavened bread in January had something her neighbors needed, and sharing it cost nothing. Ibn Hayt came 3 weeks later. He came alone on foot in the late afternoon, when the light was long and golden, and the prairie smelled of warm earth and growing grass. He carried nothing. No notebook, no flower, no excuse for the visit. He simply appeared at the door, hat in hand, looking at the wooden threshold the way a man looks at a border he's not sure he's allowed to cross. Karel opened the door and saw him and said nothing. He stepped aside and Eben entered. It was the first time Eben Hayt had been inside the house. He had refused Milena's invitation in September. He had avoided the mound all winter, keeping his eyes on it from his window, but never approaching the way a man avoids the grave of someone whose death he feels responsible for. Now he stood in the center of the room, hat turning slowly in his hands, and looked at everything with an attention so fierce it was almost violent. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, the stove, the shelves, the windows, the light, the air itself. He touched the packed earth wall with his palm and held it there, feeling the temperature, feeling the solidity, feeling the thing that Karel had known since childhood, and that Eben was learning for the first time at the age of 52 that earth is not cold, that earth is warm, that the cold is a liar, and the truth is underground. Milena saw the look on his face and understood it. She poured coffee, set it on the table in front of the chair nearest the stove, and gathered the children with a glance, the wordless maternal semaphore that means we are leaving now, and we are not asking why. She took Jakub and Ruzena outside to check the drainage channel, which did not need checking, and closed the door behind her. The two men sat in the room that smelled of earth and coffee, and the faint sweetness of linseed oil. The stove ticked. Outside, a meadowlark sang its call, reaching them through 4 feet of packed soil, as something distant and half imagined a sound from another country. Eben did not speak. His hand was still pressed against the wall, and Karel could see the tendons in his wrist drawn tight the way a man grips a railing when the ground shifts. Eben's breathing had changed, shallow, uneven, the breathing of someone approaching a door they'd spent years avoiding. His jaw worked. His eyes moved across the room in small, precise movements, cataloging everything. The warmth, the stillness, the soft light, the complete absence of the sounds. He lived with every winter, the cracking wood, the howling gaps, the desperate roar of a fire losing its war. This room had no war in it. This room existed in a peace so total, it was almost accusatory because it proved that peace had been available all along to anyone willing to dig for it. Eben pulled his hand from the wall and looked at his palm as though expecting the warmth to have left a mark. His throat moved. He closed his eyes and opened them, and when he opened them, something had shifted in his face, a gate lifting, a lock turning, the visible collapse of a resistance that had been structural load-bearing, holding up the entire architecture of how he'd understood the last 5 years of his life. Karel waited. He was a man who understood silence, who had spent his working life in underground spaces, where silence was the natural state where the earth imposed its own quiet, and you learned to hear what people meant in the spaces between what they said. When Eben spoke, his voice was stripped bare. No sarcasm, no bravado, no armor of any kind. Just a man's voice, roughened by cold and solitude and 5 years of carrying something too heavy to put down. 68 January, Martha. My cabin same as Harlan's, same as everyone's. That winter hit harder than this one. She got the pneumonia in the 3rd week. I burned everything I had. Tore the barn door off its hinges and fed it to the fire. Wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. She died on the 19th night. Karel did not move, did not shift in his chair, did not reach for his cup, did not offer the small physical gestures of comfort that most people offer when confronted with another person's grief. He gave Eben the only thing that mattered in that moment, the absence of reaction. The space to say what needed to be said without having to manage someone else's response to it. Eben looked at the earthen wall. His hand was still resting against it, his palm flat against the packed soil, and his fingers curled slightly, pressing into the surface as though trying to grip something that kept slipping away. If I'd known to build like this. The sentence hung in the room, unfinished, its ending, obvious and unspeakable. If I'd known Martha would be alive. If I'd known the cabin would have held. If I'd known the 19th night would have been just another night, cold outside and warm inside, and Martha would have coughed and recovered, and been sitting in this kitchen now alive, drinking this coffee, watching her husband admit he was wrong about a man who dug holes. Karel spoke carefully, each word placed like a stone in a foundation tested for balance before being set. My first winter here, same cabin, same cold. My wife, my children, inches from the same edge. I did not know either, not yet. The knowing came after. It was the most Karel Dvořák had ever said to another person about his family's suffering. And it was enough, because it was not comfort and not comparison, and not the false equivalence of someone pretending their lesser pain matched your greater one. It was acknowledgement. I was there too. Not where you were. Your place was worse, and we both know it. But close enough to see it from where I stood. Eben nodded. He picked up the coffee and drank it, and it was hot and bitter, and it went down into the hollow space that Martha's death had carved in him. And it did not fill the space, but it warmed it, and the warming was something. He set the cup down, stood, put his hat on, straightened his shoulders the way a man straightens himself before walking into weather or into a new life or into the admission that the last 5 years of grief have also been 5 years of avoidable ignorance. I want to rebuild. Not a question, not a request. A declaration spoken to the room as much as to Karel, because the room was the evidence and the argument and the verdict all at once. Karel stood too. I'll help you dig. Eben walked to the door, paused with his hand on the latch, turned back not to Karel but to the room, to the earthen walls, the steady warmth, the shelf with its linen-covered mound quietly expanding the impossible, ordinary, miraculous fact of a home that did not fight the winter because it had never needed to. I'm calling it Martha's Rest. He opened the door and walked out into the long April light. His shadow stretched behind him across the green sod of Karel's roof, and he did not look back. Reverend Josiah Pardee arrived on a Sunday in May after services, still wearing his black coat and the expression of a man who preaches about faith for a living and has just encountered evidence that faith is sometimes unnecessary because proof will do. He was 58, lean-weathered, with hands that were more comfortable holding reins than scripture, and a mind that was more interested in survival than salvation, not because he lacked belief, but because he understood after 20 years on the Kansas frontier that God helps those who help themselves, and helping yourself required knowing things, and knowing things required paying attention to the people who knew them. He had heard about Karel's house from Della Creed, who had described it to her husband, who had mentioned it to Walt Sutter, who had told everyone. The information had traveled through the settlement the way all information traveled slowly through human mouths, accumulating detail and distortion in equal measure. By the time it reached Pardee, the house had acquired the status of a legend, which made the Reverend suspicious because legends were usually disappointments and occasionally lies. The house was not a disappointment. Pardee spent 2 hours inside asking questions with the systematic thoroughness of a man who has decided to understand something completely rather than admire it superficially. He measured walls by stretching his arms. He measured the roof depth by pushing a stick through the sod until it hit the ceiling planks. He crouched beside the drainage channel and poured water from a canteen and watched it flow. He placed his hand on the earthen wall and held it there for a full minute, counting his pulse, feeling the steady warmth. Karel explained. And for the first time he explained not just how, but why. He stood beside the Reverend in the center of the room and spoke with the quiet authority of a man who has waited years for someone to ask the right question. The settlers here declare war on winter. They build wooden walls and fight the cold every day, burning fuel, sealing cracks, enduring. They are brave. But bravery is not strategy. Winter is not an enemy you can defeat. Winter is a skin, a thin, brutal, temporary skin stretched over something deeper. Below the frost line, the earth holds steady 50 degrees year after year, century after century. The cold never reaches it. I did not build a fortress against the cold. I built beneath its reach. Pardee listened. He understood immediately not the physics which he would never fully grasp, but the principle which was the same principle that governed everything he believed about the relationship between men and the world they lived in. You do not conquer nature. You read it. You find the place where it is already doing what you need, and you build there. He pulled from his coat the leather-bound church register, the book in which he recorded every birth, death, and marriage in the settlement. The book that was the community's only formal record of its own existence. He opened it to a blank page near the back past the entry for Martha Haight's death in January 1868, past the births and marriages of 5 years of frontier life, and he began to draw. The drawing took him an hour. It was not an architect's blueprint. Pardee had no training in draftsmanship, but it was precise in the way that a man's drawing is precise when he cares more about accuracy than elegance. A cross-section of the house showing the excavation, the stone foundation, the timber walls, the packed earth, the sod roof, the drainage channel, the chimney. He annotated it with measurements with arrows indicating the prevailing winter wind direction, with a brief notation explaining the principle of thermal mass in language so plain it could have been a recipe. Earth stays 50 degrees below the frost line. House borrows that warmth. 3 walls and roof buried. Only east face exposed. Small stove, little fuel, drainage essential gravel trench sloped away, emptied into swale. He blew on the ink to dry it, closed the book and held it against his chest. Karel watched him, and something passed between the two men. Not gratitude, not admiration, but recognition. The recognition of a builder who has spent his life creating things that disappear into the ground, by a record keeper who has spent his life making sure that things which disappear are not forgotten. The register went back to the church, and the church was where everyone came on Sundays, and the drawing was in the register, and the register sat on the pulpit, and within a month every homesteader in the settlement had seen it. Walt Sutter asked Pardee's permission to copy the drawing, and Pardee granted it, and Walt pinned the copy to the wall behind his counter, between the price list for flour and the notice about the mail schedule. The drawing hung there all summer, yellowing in the heat, curling at the corners, and every person who came through Walt's door saw it and asked about it, and Walt answered by tapping a finger on 2 lines in his ledger, open on the counter for anyone to read. The numbers spoke without commentary. One household's fuel column showed a single autumn entry, the others filled half a page. Numbers, simple, brutal, irrefutable numbers. Not theory, not philosophy, not the abstract argument of a man from somewhere else with strange ideas about how to live. Just numbers. And numbers did what no argument could do. They converted. By June, when the earth was soft enough to work, and the long summer days provided light from 5 in the morning, until 9 at night, 4 families began digging. Harlan Creed was first. He'd been planning since February, pacing off dimensions on his property, selecting a south-facing slope that would give him better drainage than Karel's flat site. He hired the Ohio brothers to help with the heavy excavation, paying them in labor hours he'd repay during harvest. Della supervised the layout, notebook in hand, checking dimensions against the diagrams she'd drawn in Milena's kitchen. Eben Haight dug alone. He chose a spot on the east side of his quarter section, sheltered by a low ridge facing the morning sun. Karel came on the 3rd day carrying his pickaxe and began working the opposite end of the excavation without asking permission and without being thanked. The 2 men worked in silence, their tools striking the earth in alternating rhythms. Karel's pickaxe loosening Eben's shovel clearing, and the silence between them was not the absence of speech, but the presence of something that did not require it. They dug together for 4 days, and in those 4 days they exchanged perhaps 30 words. all of them practical. Rock here, move the ramp, clay's good below this line, and none of them about Martha or Winter, or the 5 years Eben had spent in a cabin that was built the wrong way for the wrong reason by a man who did not know what he did not know. On the fifth day, Eben said one thing that was not practical. They were standing at the bottom of the excavation knee-deep in pale clay, and Eben looked at the walls rising around him. The same depth, the same dimensions, the same clean-cut geometry that had baffled the settlement when Karl had done it the previous summer, and his face did something it had not done in years. It softened. "Good earth here. She'll rest easy." Karl nodded. They went back to work. Two other families followed the Pfeiffers, and a young couple named Holloway who'd arrived that spring, and had the advantage of no previous construction to abandon. By August, 5 mounds dotted the Flint Hills Prairie, where a year earlier there had been one, and the cottonwood cabins that had been the settlement's architecture now stood alongside structures that were barely visible, low green humps in the grass marked by stone chimneys and wooden faces looking less like buildings than like the land itself breathing. The knowledge that Karel Dvořák carried in his hands, the knowledge of cellars and stone and the unchanging temperature of deep earth, had crossed an ocean, survived a translation from hillside vineyards to flatland prairie, and taken root in Kansas soil the way bluestem takes root, deep and permanent and suited to the place. It had not been spread by lectures or pamphlets or the kind of aggressive advocacy that makes men defensive. It had been spread by bread dough rising on an earthen shelf by children playing in cotton, while the wind screamed outside by numbers on a ledger page, by a woman's question about water, by a reverend's drawing in a church register, by two men digging in silence. It had been spread in the end by proof, and proof does not argue. Proof simply exists, and you either see it or you don't. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And the world rearranges itself around the new knowledge, like water rearranging itself around a stone. The settlers who came after the next generation, and the generation after that, would not remember Karel Dvořák's name. The earth-sheltered homes would be built and modified, and eventually abandoned, as railroads brought cheap lumber and coal, and the economics of heating changed. 100 years later, during the oil crisis of the 1970s, American engineers and architects would rediscover the principle and give it new names: passive geothermal design, thermal mass construction, earth-sheltered architecture. They would write papers and build demonstration homes and speak at conferences, and they would believe they had invented something new because the distance between knowing and remembering is vast. And civilizations forget their own best ideas with a regularity that would be comic if the consequences were not so often tragic. But in the winter of 1873 to 1874 on the Flint Hills Prairie, none of that mattered. What mattered was this. The wind came from the northwest the way it always came, carrying cold from places that had no name and no mercy. The temperature dropped below zero, and the prairie turned white, and the cattle stood with their backs to the wind, and the creeks froze, and the sky pressed down like a hand. And from 4 low mounds scattered across the grassland, smoke lifted, not the desperate billowing of cabins at war with the cold, but something quieter. 4 faint signals, almost invisible, patient as breath. Inside one of them, the newest, the one on the east side of Eben Haight's quarter section, a man sat alone beside a small stove, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, his body warm, his cabin silent. On a shelf of packed earth mortised into the wall, a small tintype photograph in a wooden frame showed a woman with dark eyes and a mouth that curved slightly upward at the corners, as though she were about to say something. The photograph faced the room. The warm room, the dry room, the room where butter stayed soft and yeast stayed alive. And the cold was a story told by the wind outside, a story the walls did not bother to repeat. Eben looked at the photograph and lifted his cup, a gesture so small that no one would have noticed it. Not a toast, not a ceremony, just a man raising his coffee toward a woman who was not there and would never be there and who deserved to have been there. "Rest easy, Martha." He drank. The stove ticked. The smoke rose from the house he'd built in the earth. the house that did not fight the winter because it had learned finally not to. A mile to the west, in the oldest mound, Milena Dvorak set a lump of fresh dough on the earthen shelf and covered it with a clean linen cloth. She did this every evening. She would do it every evening for years. The dough would rise overnight in the steady warmth of the wall, and in the morning she would shape it into loaves, and the bread would bake in the small stove, and the smell would fill the room, and the room would be warm, and the warmth would come from the earth, and the earth would not run out. Karel sat at the table, carving a new toy for Ruzhena, a horse small enough to fit in her palm. Its legs slightly too thick because Karel's skill was in stone and soil, not in wood, and precision with rock did not translate to delicacy with a whittling knife. Jakub was reading by lamplight, his lips moving over the words of a primer. Milena had ordered from a catalogue, his finger tracing the sentences with the concentration of a boy who understood that knowledge was the most valuable thing a person could carry, because it weighed nothing and could not be taken away. Outside the wind blew. It would always blow. The prairie would always be cold in winter and hot in summer, and indifferent to human ambition in every season. The grass would grow and die and grow again, and the soil beneath it would hold steady at 50 degrees year after year, century after century, offering its warmth to anyone patient enough to dig down to it and wise enough to stay. Karel Dvořák had been wise enough, not because he was smarter than his neighbors. Harlan Creed was sharper. Eben Haight was tougher. Reverend Party was more learned. Karel had been wise enough because he had known one thing. They didn't a thing so simple. It could be said in a single sentence, a thing his father had taught him in a cellar, half a world away, by pressing a boy's palm against cool stone and saying nothing, letting the stone speak for itself. The earth remembers warmth the way the sky forgets it. That was all. That was everything. The rest was just digging.